Welcome. I'm Sebastian Mahfoud, and you're listening to WCAT Radio, the on-air wing of En Route Books and Media, bringing you the dulcet sounds of Catholic wisdom. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Intercultural Competencies webinar, sponsored by Holy Apostles and co-sponsored by the Two Wings Seminar, which is a production of the Holy Apostles faculty. St. John Paul II said that faith and reason are like two wings on which the human spirit rises to the contemplation of truth. And God has placed in the human heart a desire to know the truth, in a word, to know himself, so that by knowing and loving God, men and women may also come to the fullness of truth about themselves. In today's seminar, we will have with us M.T. Davila. She's Associate Professor of Christian Ethics at Andover-Newton Theological School. And her presentation today is entitled Dignity and Difference, the Challenges of Race and Gender in Light of Human Dignity. Dr. Davila is a laywoman in the Roman Catholic tradition. She completed her doctorate at Boston College with a dissertation entitled A Liberation Ethic for the One-Third World, the Preferential Option for the Poor, and Challenges to Middle-Class Christianity in the United States. Her main interests are the intersections of class identity formation and Christian ethics in the U.S. context. Her research looks for the intersection of these issues with respect to the relationship of class and militarism, class and immigration, and class and activism. Professor Davila lives in Malden with her family, her husband Rob, and 4 children. She is a member of St. Joseph's Church, a Roman Catholic parish in Malden. MT, thank you very much for being here with us today.
Thank you, Sebastian. It's great to be here and looking forward to the conversation.
Absolutely. Now, for our listening audience, we are going to play a half-hour presentation that has been pre-recorded, and the value of our playing this now is that those of you who would like to see the presentation may go to the Two Wings website or to the Intercultural Competencies webinar site. So the easier of the two to get to is go to wcatradio.com/twowings.html. And you'll see right under the image of MT a YouTube video, and you can click play on that. And the YouTube video will last for a little over half an hour. And those of you listening by radio can simply listen, and you don't have to move. And at the end of the presentation, we'll come back here live, and we'll give you the opportunity to call in and ask questions. So we'll start the audio in just a moment. If you would, MT, go ahead and put your phone on mute. I'll do likewise,
Okay.
And then we'll connect the presentation.
All right.
I'll see you back in half an hour.
My name is M.T. Davila. I'm Associate Professor of Christian Ethics at Andover-Newton Theological School. Today, I'd like to talk to you about the challenges of race and gender within the Church and in society in light of human dignity, and I've titled my comments, Dignity in Difference. It really is a huge question or task to address both race and gender in a 30-minute conversation, but what I'm hoping we can do in this time and in the question and answer period later, and if you wish to engage me and others after that, is to look specifically at resources from Catholic social teaching on these two issues to get a broad sense of how to speak about them in the context of Catholic social teaching, but also in the context of larger society and events that we are experiencing both in the United States but also globally in April of 2018. Recording this on the day after we remember and commemorated the 50th anniversary of the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr. So that significance and symbolism is not lost to me on our conversation. So I hope you see it in this context. So human dignity in Catholic social teaching is the principal or highest concept that we get from this 100-year plus documentary history, from teachings from the Church about what it means to be a disciple in community, in society, in the political structures, in the political body. And within that, every single human being, as this image presents, has an inherent value and worth that is God-given, that is primary, and that cannot be taken away. So in light of that, political structures and policies must be affirmed in the same way. Human dignity in Catholic social teaching has been framed throughout, like I said, throughout the 100+ years of this documentary history, and there are some specific passages that give light to this teaching. St. John Paul II is most responsible for giving to us a really specific way of framing it and utilizing it in all his teachings. From Centesimus Annus we get, human persons are willed by God, they are imprinted with God's image, their dignity does not come from the work they do, but from the persons they are. Again, this is God-given and not something that any political system, any sorts of borders, or any vision of racial superiority can erase. St. John the 23rd in Mater et Magistra tells us individual human beings are the foundation, the cause, and the end of every social institution. And from that moment on, we're going to get in the Church the sense of integral development or integral human ecology. That is, that all of the spectrum of dimensions of human activity in the world have to be accompanied or have to be judged by the criteria of human dignity, regardless of how insignificant they may be or how intimate they may be within the family or larger structures in the community. Human dignity is at the center of every social institution. Further on, we get in the United States Catholic bishops in their pastoral letter, Economic Justice for All, tell us specifically to economic systems that the basis for all that the Church believes about the moral dimension of economic life is its vision of the transcendent worth, the sacredness of human beings. The dignity of the human person realized in community with others is the criterion against which all aspects of economic life must be measured. So these are just some of the highlights of Catholic social teaching on human dignity. There's so many more if you wish to explore this. But what it's telling us is that this is the primary value, the primary criterion by which we are to judge all our interactions and all structures and policies and practices in our community. And we'll get back to that sense of how important practices and traditions are, because sometimes we may consider that our institutions try to uphold equality, that our institutions try to uphold human dignity, but then we see that in reality, in practice, they're not doing so. In reality and in practice, they are excluding certain groups, or they are doing outright violence to certain groups. So alternately, Catholic social teaching also tells us how human dignity is challenged, how sin and different expressions of sin make us to do damage to each other in society, both interpersonally, of course, that's personal sin, but also structurally, that we can build up structures, we can support systems that in essence are an affront to human dignity. In the Catechism of the Catholic Church, we hear there exists also sinful inequalities that affect millions of men and women. These are in open contradiction of the gospel. Their equal dignity as persons demands that we strive for fairer and more humane conditions. Excessive economic and social disparity between individuals and peoples of the one human race is a source of scandal and militates against social justice, equity, human dignity, as well as social and international peace. And we'll come back to that notion of peace as being one of the principles that when we look at race and gender, when there is no peace, those racial violence and gender violence are one of the expressions of the lack of peace that we experience more severely and more immediately. And then from Gaudium et Spes and the Second Vatican Council of the Constitution of the Church in the Modern World, we see whatever insults human dignity, such as subhuman living conditions, arbitrary imprisonment, deportation, slavery, prostitution, the selling of women and children, as well as disgraceful working conditions where men are treated as mere tools for profit, rather than as free and responsible persons. All these things and others of their life are infamies indeed. They poison human society, but they do more harm to those who practice them than those who suffer from the injury. So there you see a catalog of the ways in which human dignity can be affronted. Anything from subhuman living conditions, which is certainly something like homelessness or lack of access to clean water or lack of access to employment, slavery, and we'll talk about modern slavery in a moment, prostitution, affronts to women, domestic violence, human trafficking. All of these are affronts to human dignity, whether in great forms or in minor forms. And so there's degrees within each of these that can be examined in the spaces that we live in and that we minister in. So these are just some images to speak about how we see affronts to human dignity, specifically because of race and because of gender today. So the first image on social exclusion, it's talking about three dimensions in which life in society is greatly impacted when we are excluded. So quality of life, health and well-being, living environment, crime, harm, and criminalization. For those of you that may be from the context of the United States, when you look at living environment and you look at, we're going to touch on this a little later, the question of racial environmental injustice, that in fact in the U.S. and globally, Black and brown communities, not just poorer communities, but Black and brown communities specifically, are ones that suffer the impact of environmental degradation first, that it gets attended less quickly. And we can see that, for example, in the case of Flint, Michigan, where the water was tainted, and the community, which is mainly made of Black and brown families and also very poor families that include poor white families, have had to deal with unclean, tainted water, tainted with lead, that has impacted the well-being of their children. On the resources side, social exclusion brings in lack of material and economic resources, access to public and private services, social resources, and education and skills. So for both women and Black and brown communities, or racially other communities from the dominant groups, are excluded from educational and employment opportunities, from political opportunities, and access to public services and institutions. With respect to participation, again, these groups are either not given the right to vote, to make decisions for their own destiny, and their shaping of their own communities. Decisions are made for them in ways that really impact their well-being and their access. And also with respect to cultural participation, they are asked to integrate to a dominant model of cultural belonging and expressions, whether in the public sphere or in the private sphere as well. On the gender exclusion side, there's the next image of gender wage gap is just for you to see, especially in the U.S., what wage discrimination looks like, where you have the male, like for every dollar that a male earns, different people, different images of women or different expressions of different women are going to earn differently from the $1 that the male earns, sometimes significantly less if these women are either African American or Latino in the United States. Globally, the next image on the bottom left speaks about 1 in 3 women worldwide subject to violence over the course of their lives, which is a pretty standard statistic. It's one that has been recognized globally. And violence here is described broadly, but it can range from anything from feminicide, that is the particular targeting of women and girls for the fact that they're women and girls, to be killed, dismembered, or abducted, etc., or systemically raped or done violence to, not as a sexual crime, but as a gender crime. So that is as a crime because they specifically target these persons as women. They're also, women will suffer an inordinate amount of violence from war that is targeted at them by virtue of being women and by virtue of being the ones that are responsible often for the household, and therefore when there are situations of war, attacking women and destroying the dignity of women is one way in which the opponent in a situation of war will try to gain advantage over their people that they're trying to attack. And we, of course, have a legacy of slavery. That's the next image. A legacy of slavery in the United States and globally. But we do have numbers of modern-day slavery which do surpass the numbers of enslaved peoples in colonial U.S. and in the Americas. We have children and women being trafficked, and often these are people who are racially and in terms of gender, minorities in their context. So they are made more vulnerable. They are more vulnerable for being trafficked, and race has a lot to do with where these bodies come from and where these slaves come from. And both Pope Benedict and Pope Francis have been very vocal about the church playing a role in ending modern-day slavery. So this is something that we see as deep affronts to human dignity today. In order to understand the kinds of affront to human dignity that racial and gender violence play, it's important to have a working knowledge of what structural sin is. And Catholic social teaching doesn't necessarily speak about structural sin as its own element. There is a tradition within Catholicism that wants sin to be, or that tries to uphold that sin is the personal decision of every person, so that structures don't necessarily lead us to sin. We follow these structures, and then we as individuals fall into sin. Other dimensions of Catholic life, theologians, etc., liberation theology and other theologies talk about structural sin. And that is, I'm defining that as that in addition to personal sin, structural sin concerns the institutions and traditions that either by their very nature, such as slavery, or in the practices they sustain or encourage, such as unfettered consumption, present an affront to the dignity of the human family and of particularly vulnerable institutions or persons within that the human family. So we are now talking about practices, structures, policies, laws in our society that by their very nature are exclusionary and enact violence on particular groups, or impose violence, impose lesser conditions on particular groups. So for example, carving out areas where a particular group of people cannot live, or in not attending to the sanitation needs of a large swath of the population. or not attending to how education, for example, might be quite disparate from one group to another. One community may have a very good education, whereas a system, whereas another community will have a much poorer education system. One place where this, just an example that comes to mind, is from a student of mine who wrote a report on his home country, where he says private schools give a much superior education to those who can afford it and those who can pay for it. And usually these are Catholic schools in that country. Then public schools, where the assignments for teaching are given because of political favors, and they're not really, public schools are not attended financially by the government. The teachers are not held up to standards. Sometimes teachers are absent for days at a time. And because it's a political assignment to be a teacher, and it's a political favor, children end up suffering. They show up to school, but they don't get an education. So this is a way in which there is in that country an educational differential that is impacting different groups of people because of their ability to pay for schooling, and often that is related to ethnic group or racial group. So let's look specifically at racism as a structural sin, as a social evil in which we participate both socially but also personally. We get from the compendium of the Social Doctrine of the Church, quote, "Despite the widespread aspiration to build an authentic international community, the unity of the human family has not yet become a reality. This is due to obstacles originating in materialistic and nationalistic ideologies that contradict the values of the person integrally, considered in all their various dimensions, material and spiritual, individual and community. In particular, any theory or form whatsoever of racism and racial discrimination is morally unacceptable." So types of discrimination and racial violence that we can see, or racial oppression that we can see, are discrimination in education and employment. We've already seen that, or I've already covered some of that. Violence to particular communities. So when a particular community is targeted, either through political or any other form of violence, that is unacceptable as a sign of racial structural sin and violence. Environmental racism, which I covered, so understanding that certain communities that typically are Black, brown, and poor are receiving the initial impact and the greatest impact from environmental degradation. Unequal and disproportionately punitive treatment in the criminal justice system. So when we have summary killing of unarmed Black men in the United States by the police, or overly punitive sentences being handed out to Black and brown men, especially women, increasingly in the U.S. Court system for the same crimes as white men and women, that inequality and disproportionate assignment of sentencing is an occasion of racial injustice. Immigration and settlement policies biased against particular groups or countries. So when we have an immigration policy that is applied with discrimination, particularly against certain groups, so that the same policy applies differently depending on where you come from, and often depending on the color of your skin or your ethnicity, that is also another case of racial injustice. With respect to gender violence and exclusion, the Catechism of the Catholic Church tells us that every form of social or cultural discrimination in fundamental personal rights on the grounds of sex, race, color, social conditions, language, or religion must be curbed and eradicated as incompatible with God's design. So issues such as unequal pay that we observed in the image in a few slides before, intimate partner violence, human trafficking, but the trafficking of women for sexual slavery and other kinds of slavery, forced labor and forced slavery, forced marriage, in communities where that continues to happen. Female genital mutilation, again, in communities where that continues to happen. Exclusions in educational and employment opportunities. So difference, those are dimensions in which women, by virtue of being women, are subjected to a different level of opportunities, life prospects, well-being, physical, mental, and spiritual integrity. So that difference in treatment, but also a greater impact of violence, is considered gender exclusion and gender violence, and it is, as the Catechism states, incompatible with God's design. Catholic social teaching offers us a whole host of resources to begin to speak to these issues. So, for example, we began the presentation about the primacy of human dignity in the principles of Catholic social teaching, as well as other principles, but really all of them stemming from the primacy of human dignity. That is that, as I mentioned earlier, that bodily, mental, and spiritual integrity of the human being, personally and in community, so and in her or his social dimensions, is the first and foremost goal of the economy, of political structures, and mediating structures in civil society. Other principles of Catholic social teaching that help us to speak to what we should do as people of faith, and especially as communities of faith and our churches, include the option for the poor. That is, that imitating Christ asks that we stand in solidarity with the most vulnerable members of our society. That is, those members of our society that are most excluded, most on the margins, who receive the impact, a negative impact from our policies, that as a church we ought to consider our place with them. Pope Francis has made it a point that we ought to smell like sheep, that those who minister to God's church ought to smell like sheep. That is, we ought to be outside the doors of the church, outside the doors of the sanctuary, and in the streets with those who are most vulnerable. Often these will be Black and brown communities and communities of sexually excluded minorities that include members of the transgender community, women, and lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender youth especially, who are often at risk of violence targeted directly at them by virtue of being women or transgender or gay, but also at risk of homelessness because of exclusionary housing policies, etc. Another principle of Catholic social teaching that might be helpful is the integrity of creation, protecting the environment and those most impacted by the ravages of climate change. In Laudato Si, Pope Francis speaks to women in particular as and indigenous communities and communities in the Southern Hemisphere as those most directly impacted by climate change. And therefore, we must attend to that dimension of the integrity of creation and caring for creation. Peace and disarmament, I mentioned earlier that, in fact, wherever there is conflict, armed conflict in the world, women and racial minorities, ethnic minorities, are going to be the most directly impacted. Violence against women as a weapon of war is outlawed, of course, by the United Nations and globally understood to be a crime of war, but continues to be a method of war and conflict that is used globally. Another principle, dignity of labor, would inform us that just wages, so equal pay for equal work, the protection of workers, business enterprises, to understand that business enterprises are for the benefit of workers and the community, not for profit, would have us look specifically at how our labor practices and policies impact the life of women. If a woman, John Paul II in Laborem Exercens talked about when a head of household or a woman has to take on more than one job to keep a home and food for their family and feed their family, then that is a working condition that does not uphold the dignity of that worker and of their person and their family, which is the next principle I would like to mention, upholding the family and the centrality of family in Catholic social teaching, looking out for the integrity of all members of the family, especially women and children, when social conditions such as war, migration, famine, or policies threaten their well-being. Another resource from Catholic social teaching is the acknowledgement of the important role of women in the Church that we received this from St. John Paul II to Benedict XVI and now Pope Francis, being really clear that without women, the Church would not be the Church of God. Without their leadership, without their contributions, it would not be the Church that Christ instituted. And therefore, we must find ways that both within Church, within our institutions, our schools, our hospitals, and other institutions that are funded and grounded in Church teaching, uphold the dignity of women in all its dimensions, but especially when it comes to wages, when it comes to possibilities for participation and advancing in a profession. Finally, strong support for human rights, the rights of migrants, the protection of youth and children, and integral human development are other principles and knowledge that we receive from Catholic social teaching that will help us address racial and gender violence and oppression. Just want to close with identifying some tensions that remain. That is, these are tensions that Catholic social teaching might really give us some great principles, but when we come into putting them into practice, there might be some conflict in how we do so and in understanding our possibilities in doing so. So, for example, identifying the role of advocacy and nonviolent resistance and civil disobedience in social transformation for greater equality and justice. Catholic social teaching advocates for the political process to be where Christians affect transformation in the world. But there are moments in which advocacy and community organizing, nonviolent resistance is necessary when structural evil is such that it really attacks and affronts human dignity of some groups. And that tension has always existed. Churches, especially in the U.S., which is my context, have a hard time getting involved in activism, marches, the kinds of transformation or demands for transformation that we are seeing more recently. And so we need to have robust discussions about how we deal with that in our churches. Upholding the dignity of women within the Church when considering the question of the exclusion of holy orders. So a male priesthood presents for some women and for some communities a real challenge because they see that the church, they interpret that as the Church not upholding the full dignity of women. And again, it's an issue that concerns many, and that especially women who feel a strong call to the priesthood, but cannot entertain moving into that. Respecting the role of civil society in protecting human dignity as it implements policies contrary to Catholic teaching on gender and sexuality. So when communities, political bodies, governments move to upholding, same-sex marriage, the rights of transgender persons, etc., the Church needs to consider which principle it's going to privilege. Is it, the teaching on marriage, or is it protecting human dignity of communities that are typically more vulnerable? These are in tension, and we as leaders in the Church, people who hope to minister in the Church, need to look at this tension and examine it carefully, on how it operates in our context and what would be the most faithful ways of resolving that tension. Balancing the role of the state and protection of its borders while defending the rights of all people to seek a life free of persecution with greater dignity for self and family. That is a question that globally it is supremely important, and that is the role of the state in protecting its borders vis-a-vis the rights of migrants, which the Catholic Church upholds, to move across borders in search of greater dignity and to flee persecution and violence. Again, a tension that churches must examine and speak publicly not just about its own principles, but about how it's trying to answer and advocate for greater dignity for families, especially families of migrants. So I hope this very brief account of these two issues in light of human dignity and Catholic social teaching just gives you some more language, raises some important questions for you, and prepares you to search further and learn further on these issues. Thank you.
I'd like to thank you very much for that very helpful, that very informative presentation. I understand that there is a great deal more to talk about on these topics. In Catholic social teaching, we have quite a vast realm of opportunity to engage other human persons in authentic ways. And when we talk about authentic means of engagement, we may mean certain things. What would you say would be the most authentic way to engage another human person, even in light of their race or their gender?
Sure. Well, I'm going to stick to the grounding on human dignity just to have a framework of where we can answer these questions. And there could be some other, I'm going to use the definitions that we rehearsed in the presentation today, acknowledging that there might be some discussion on what human dignity itself might mean depending on how it's being defined, especially when you speak about authentic means of engagement. But to stick with both what Catholic social teaching gives us and the framework that I'd like to use is that and in fact it's very Quaker in its principle from Quakerism in the United States, which is that we encounter the other as if we're encountering the light of God in that person, right? Dorothy Day as well would use that framework, right? That when you encounter someone else, if we think about the mystical body of Christ, that would be Dorothy Day's interpretation. You are, and also, my goodness, so much of patristics is grounded on this. You're encountering the image of God. You're encountering the light of God. You're encountering a member of the mystical body of Christ, and therefore, authentic engagement with that is one where you honor that. Your interactions ought to honor that presence of the holy in the other. Uphold it, but also increase it, right? So that when we are together, our being together, in fact, ought to increase that light in the world, ought to increase that light in each other. Interpersonally, a Protestant theologian and public figure, Reinhold Niebuhr, might say, interpersonally, that might be easier. It might be easier in our families, communities where we are very close to each other. We know each other well. We trust each other. We might also hurt each other more, but forgiveness might come a little easier. Socially and politically and economically, our structures can be so large and so globalized that it becomes a little harder. So, what does it mean to have authentic engagement when we consider, say, the evil of human trafficking and the possibility that something I'm purchasing might be contributing to the enslavement of another human being somewhere in the world, that the product is being made with slave labor, or the product is being made by women whose rights are not being respected, who are not earning any wages or are earning unjust wages. So it is then becomes a more difficult assignment on that the examination of conscience that is not just about one-on-one, me and you or me and my children and what happens in my intimate circles, but those, if we look at Thomas Aquinas' circles of charity, right, it's that bullseye that it's how I always picture it, where Aquinas tells us that their Christian love, Christian charity, extends outward from ourselves to different circles of influence. The initial circle of influence is the one most intimate to us, one most closest to us, which is our family, and then increasingly community, neighborhood, state, nation, global, if you extend it far enough. But he says, just because a circle of influence is further removed from you, it does not mean that you do not love in that, you don't affect Christian love in that circle. In fact, it just means you have to figure out how that is done. You owe more ethically to that circle immediate to you, but you still are called to love that circle that's beyond you, and that might be less intimate, such as the global economy. So when I hear authentic means of engagement, it really is that demand to examine my conscience, to examine my actions as to how I am extending Christian love in all the circles of influence and that I have, and in all the interactions that I engage in, that I may see, that I might not be able to see.
So it really is a matter of personal conversion if we're to live this social teaching.
Yeah, I'm going to tell you, as someone who, how long have I been doing this? Like a while. So over 20 years, right? An ethicist around 20 years or so. And that has been, is one of my biggest tensions, right? I talked in that last slide and the last moments of the presentation about the tensions that still remain, and that is what's the role of personal conversion and what is the role of social transformation, and can you have one without the other? Can you have social transformation without personal conversion? I think we've seen catastrophically in history what happens in the world when social transformations and social projects are effected and enacted without personal conversion and personal transformation. The tendency is to absolutize ideologies that then become increasingly violent and exclusive, or excluding whole groups of people in fairly tragic and violent ways. And John Paul II, especially with the finesse that his social teaching presented, really warned us about that. He warned us about that with respect to socialism as was being practiced in the Soviet Union and Soviet allies at the time, warned us in terms of the global economy and in terms of market capitalism and unfettered consumption. That is, that all our visions for social transformation must be grounded in human dignity and must be grounded in a human dignity that, like you suggest, touches us individually, in our hearts, in our souls, and that transform us toward the dignity of others, to uphold the dignity of others. And where that is absent, the consequences are tragic in historical ways.
So this violence against human dignity, in terms of racism, in terms of misogyny, is really systemic. And let's say I were to personally convert, and say a number of us were to personally convert today and make a decision to end systemic racism and systemic oppression of women. What are some ways in which we would be able to make an impact as individuals?
Well, the thing is, individuals have to participate in structures, right? So we all cannot be desert monks. We all cannot be cloistered communities where, and that's it's some of what's being touted more recently as the Benedict option, but it's something that has been, it's one of the options that has been talked about throughout the Christian tradition. That is, that smaller communities of committed individuals more easily adopt principles so that for their own small community that imitate the gospel, imitate Christ, and that uphold the dignity of all the members of that community. So two things to that. One is that's not an option that's available to everyone, and that's not an option that many readings of the gospel and of Christian life would advocate for. And it's not an option that Catholic social teaching advocates for. Catholic social teaching advocates for a real public and invested and active role for the faithful to play as individuals and as communities in the public square and in the design of their political, economic, and cultural institutions. And so that retreat to a small community is one option, but it's not the preferred option of Catholic social teaching. So let's just begin there. So when we talk about what can individuals do to confront racism and misogyny and other forms of sexism and sexual violence and oppression, is first to become educated, to learn how people of different groups are living and how the policies of the structures that we participate in are impacting different groups, whether our immediate, again, referring back to Aquinas' circles of charity, what are the groups and what are the different communities in which I have some influence? Yes, my family, yes, my neighborhood, but am I part of a university structure? Am I part of a larger corporation? Am I part of a structure in civil society, say a school committee or a city council or even a neighborhood co-op? Where are my circles of influence where, inspired by the values of human dignity and other principles of Catholic social teaching, I can see, so to use the rubric of see, judge, act, see what is going on, and see what is going on from the perspective of those that are most on the margins, then judge use the principles of Catholic social teaching, use the gospel to judge that situation and what is the injustice that is happening here, and then determine a course of action, but determine a course of action alongside those who are marginalized. So if I am an individual and I say, you know what, I'm noticing that girls in my school or girls in my university or women in my university are not receiving equal treatment or the same opportunities in, say, science and technology fields or in sports or whatnot, leaving them to graduate at a disadvantage than other members of this community, mainly the men of the community that are graduating, if we're speaking about a school. What can I do along with them, in devising strategies for change, in finding ways to transform that institution? I want to add one more piece, which I refer to somewhat briefly in the presentation, and that is sin. I'm always an advocate for understanding sin and mentioning it, and that is many of our structures in a lot of our towns, states, nations, we want to believe that we have instituted safeguards for injustice, safeguards for differential treatment, corrections for exclusion. Again, I began referencing the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr., which we commemorated yesterday, the 50th anniversary. And there's a sense, in many ways, there's a sense that we say, well, 50 years after the March on Selma and the Civil Rights Movement, we have fixed all our laws to no longer be exclusionary or oppressive to African Americans or Black and Brown people. And we forget sin. We forget that, in fact, we sin, and we sin gravely. And we sin gravely in ways that impact entire communities. And so when you ask the question, what can I do for social transformation, there is a level of humility that acknowledging our sin brings on. And we just closed the season of Lent. We closed Holy Week, where the intention is precisely that, is to understand how easily we fall into practices and structures that do violence to others in the way that bring about multiple crucifixions. I'm sure that the Romans thought that they had the most just system in their hands, and still their ways and byways were littered with the debris and the blood of crucified people, just like they are today. And so that acknowledgement of personal and structural sin, and examining those situations we find ourselves in from the perspective of the marginalized, from the perspective of women, from the perspective of Black and brown folk, that in itself is an act of grace, something that I engage in because of being gifted with the grace of God to self-correct and to reform and to do penance for my sin, but also one that will lead me to seek change and to seek avenues for change alongside those who are already in that struggle. And so that very last piece I mentioned would be the last thing, right? So we do an examination of conscience, we acknowledge our sin, we understand that there's a public role that we ought to play, and that we have circles of influence where we have an ability to act and where we have agency. And then finally, we do that in community. We don't do it as a lone wolf. There is nothing in the gospel that is done as a lone wolf, right? Everything in the gospel is about being in community, about going 2 by 2, about sharing meals, about moving out to encounter others. And so when we say we want to enact change and transform sexist and racist structures, we gotta link up. We've gotta hook into. We've gotta find our tribe, as the contemporary language is, right? We gotta find our tribe where people are doing that in ways that uphold gospel values and that might echo the principles of Catholic social teaching.
Right, and that's a very excellent thing to call to mind in this Easter octave, that we are Easter people, and we have the entire Easter season in which to reflect on that. So yes. If as individuals we are part of corporate and social structures, and if the church is comprised of people, as individuals we are the church, is it possible for, say, the church to be feminist?
I think so, and I think that it's a term that we have to recover. That feminism is about it is concomitant with human dignity. There is nothing in the Catholic social teaching about human dignity that is antagonist to feminism. And I'm sure, if this is, if what I've said, when what I've said is made public, I'm sure I'll get a lot of pushback. But I firmly,
I'm putting your email address
believe,
on the website.
That's right. Oh, please do. I firmly believe that that in fact the vision of Catholic social teaching of human dignity is feminist, and that is that image of God in women and girls from conception to natural death is something that ought to be upheld, defended, increased, celebrated. Now, there is the tension that there is, and I'm in many ways I'm a Christian realist, so I'm happy to live in the tension. Not happy, but I feel like that's just part of the Christian call. The tension is, does that necessitate or imply equality of roles, equality of labors, equality of functions. And that's really where the tricky parts are, right? Especially when we talk about groups advocating for women's ordination or questions about other roles that might be limited for women. And that is a difficult conversation to have, but I think that difficulty should not make us shy away from using the term feminist for a feminist church. I think it would be very powerful. One of the pieces that I'm learning more recently about social transformation and especially toward justice, especially in the U.S. and globally, is that the faithful, not just in Catholicism, but in other Protestant traditions and in other world religions, will sort of look to the pulpit for permission. And it's yes, we may have our own independent sense of what society calls us to do, or what we are as political beings, or what we are as economic beings, but there's a sense in which what is spoken about from the pulpit, and even what we see on the altar, dictates or gives us permission to entertain certain questions. And so that concept of is the Catholic Church a feminist church, that's not talked about from the pulpit. So it almost begins to imply that human dignity in Catholic social teaching is a male-centered concept, is a male characterized and defined concept. And I think that's very far from the truth, and I think that's very damaging. But again, especially for our listeners to this broadcast that have some role in teaching the faithful, either from the pulpit or in any sort of religious education program, great power that comes in that, in giving permission to the faithful to envision and develop the imagination to see society and their role in society in particular ways, and both by what we say and what we fail to say from those places of pedagogical power in the church. So I want to end with that invitation that people consider, again, circles of charity. Where are there places of influence and agency, and especially of pedagogical power, where they're going to influence other people, other faithful, in how to understand their role as agents of change?
It's a powerful invitation, and I want to thank you. We've been speaking today with MT Davila, and her contact information will be on our website. This is the start of a conversation, more than anything, because of how deep, rich, and complex it really is. And MT, thank you for today shedding some light on what the salient issues are and how we may, as individuals and as a church, move forward.
Thank you. My pleasure.
All right. You're listening to the Two Wings seminar and to the Intercultural Competencies webinar, sponsored in part by the Association of Theological Schools through a grant to promote intercultural competencies at Holy Apostles. Have a blessed week, and we'll see you back next week for another Two Wings seminar on another topic of great interest to our community. We hope you enjoyed the program and will join us back for another show on WCAT Radio. This is Sebastian Mahfoud. Good day.